The wine glass trembled slightly in her hand, not because she was nervous, but because she had been holding it for too long. Across the table, silverware clinked, and laughter bloomed in waves. Birthday candles flickered on a chocolate cake still untouched. Her brother leaned back, grinning. Her mother stared down at her plate, chewing too carefully. A distant uncle let out a bark of laughter already 2 whiskeys in. And then her father's voice, loud enough to slice through the candlelight, casual enough to draw blood. "Anna, sweetheart, if you're lucky, maybe you'll land a decent husband. Otherwise, I guess it's the cashier's life for you." No one flinched. Not her brother. Not her mother. Someone chuckled. Someone sipped their drink. She smiled. A small one, polite, unmoving. But under the table, her hand clenched around the linen napkin so tightly her nails carved into her skin. The chandelier above gave off a soft golden glow, too warm, too gentle for what had just been said. The laughter returned. The moment passed, or so they thought. Somewhere deep inside her chest, a switch flipped a quiet calibration. Not anger, not revenge, just a decision. Later, when they would speak her name on government stages, when her uniform caught the light of national cameras, when her signature launched satellites, and her voice echoed across war rooms, they'd still remember this night. Not because she yelled, not because she cried, but because she didn't. Because she had smiled as if it meant nothing, while the universe had just whispered to her, "Get ready." And somewhere quietly beneath the hum of birthday songs and clinking forks, the stars began to move. The dining room glowed under warm pendant lights, casting a golden sheen across the polished mahogany table set for 12. It was her younger brother's birthday, the kind of occasion her family took seriously. Traditional, loud, and choreographed, like a Broadway production of normalcy. Her father sat at the head, of course, one leg crossed over the other, swirling a glass of Cabernet like a talk show host, ready for the next punchline. He was what some called old-school American, the type of man who told jokes that only men laughed at, who considered confidence a form of dominance, and who didn't know how to listen unless it was to his echo. Around him, uncles and cousins laughed too easily. Her brother, recently turned 15, wore a new polo shirt and sat surrounded by admiration. Aunts passed dishes: roast chicken, baked macaroni, garlic bread browned just right, and someone had brought a home-baked pecan pie with a lattice crust, though no one asked if Anna liked pecans. They never did. She was seated at the far end, just close enough to be seen, too far to be remembered. The kind of seat that felt assigned by some invisible hand that decided her presence was more decoration than personhood. She didn't say much. She'd learned not to. At 17, Anna knew her role: be agreeable, polite, smart, but not too smart. She picked at her plate, half listening as conversations lapped over one another. Football summer internships, someone's new BMW, someone else's toddler. Her Uncle Bruce was already tipsy, slurring a little when he laughed. And then it happened. The sound came suddenly, and yet not at all unexpectedly, like thunder after a long silence. Her father raised his glass, smiled widely, and let his voice carry down the table. "Anna, sweetie. Well, if you're lucky, maybe you'll marry a decent guy. If not," he chuckled, "well, there's always cashiering at Target." The room broke into casual laughter. Her brother nearly choked on his soda. Uncle Bruce guffawed like it was a line from a sitcom. Her mother didn't laugh. She didn't say a word. She simply looked down at her plate fork, frozen midair, as if willing herself to disappear into the mashed potatoes. And Anna. She smiled, a small, quiet curve of the lips that didn't reach her eyes. She even nodded faintly, a performance perfected over the years. But under the table, her hand gripped her thigh so hard, her nails etched half-moons into her skin. She felt her breath steady into stillness, a trick she'd taught herself to remain frozen until the moment passed like prey pretending not to bleed. In her head, the sound of clinking glasses and scattered laughter echoed like the inside of a cave. The slow-motion moment didn't come from a camera, but from her own body, pulling her inward. Her father's voice warped in her ears, distorted, slow, almost surreal, like the muffled roar of a dream just before it turns into a nightmare. "Cashier, cashier, cashier." Her brain repeated not as an insult, but as a prophecy carved in stone. Around her, people were moving on. The next toast, the next joke, the next bite of chicken. The room had recovered, never realizing it had wounded someone. Because to them, it wasn't cruel, it was just Dad being Dad. That was the excuse. That was always the excuse. Her mother would say later, if asked, that it was just a joke. That no harm was meant. That everyone was laughing, weren't they? But in that moment, Anna wasn't laughing. She was memorizing. The smell of rosemary chicken, the faint chip in the corner of the dining table. The way her brother looked at her was like a punchline. The way her father looked at her, proud of his words. The way no one looked long enough to see her hands trembling under the table. She thought about all the things she had never said about the college brochures hidden in her drawer, the nights she'd stayed up studying while everyone else slept, the journal entries she never let anyone read. She thought about how in every family photo she was always just out of frame or half blocked by someone taller. She thought about how, when she won the state science fair last year, her father had said, "That's cute, but are you sure this is a real career?" And still she smiled. Because that's what girls like Anna were taught to do. Smile when humiliated, laugh when dismissed, and nod when the people you love most turn you invisible. She took a slow sip from her water glass, her hand now steady again. Her fingers left no trace of the pain on her lap. She didn't cry, she never did. She'd stopped crying years ago when she realized her voice had no echo in this house. Her eyes flicked to the chandelier above the table, its crystals catching the light in soft bursts. It reminded her of stars, and for a moment she imagined herself light years away, where no one would ever ask her to smile through a bruise. The dinner went on. A cousin started singing Happy Birthday off-key, and the rest of the table followed. Her brother beamed as the candles flickered. But Anna. She stayed in her place at the edge where the shadows met the glow, where girls like her were seated not to shine, but to stay quiet. Her face remained calm. But inside her, something sharp and brilliant began to take shape like metal hardening under fire. Because what the father didn't know, what no one knew, was that the girl they just tried to shrink had already mapped her way out. One equation at a time. One simulation. One secret, late night at a time. This wasn't just another birthday dinner. This was the moment Anna Nguyen became a memory machine. A machine that remembers everything, every look, every silence, every smirk that told her she wasn't enough. She would not fight it tonight. She wouldn't argue or correct or demand respect. No, she would wait. And one day when her name echoed in a room filled with generals and senators, when she wore a uniform with a rank stitched into her chest, when cameras zoomed in on her face, as Commander Anna Nguyen lit up the screen, someone would remember this dinner. And she would remember too, not with bitterness, but with precision. Anna had always been the quiet one, the good girl, the odd one, depending on who you asked and how kind they felt that day. She was the child who didn't scream for attention, because she learned early that it rarely came. From the age of 5, while other girls played house or dressed dolls, Anna built small models of the solar system with glow-in-the-dark stickers and dreamed of naming stars. She loved robots, real ones, not the toy kind, and could spend hours alone tinkering with scraps, using her brother's discarded Lego sets to simulate planetary movement. Her room was full of books and blueprints, her walls decorated with constellations she memorized before her multiplication tables. But instead of being called brilliant, she was often labeled weird. Relatives would pat her head and laugh awkwardly when she launched into explanations of gravitational waves. "That's our little scientist," they'd say, not with pride but with polite discomfort, as if hoping she'd grow out of it. Invitations to family gatherings were addressed to the Nguyen family, but more often than not she discovered they'd forgotten to include her name. One time she showed up at her cousin's birthday party, only to realize everyone else had been given customized goodie bags. Hers had been an afterthought. The same thing happened again the next year until eventually she stopped asking if there were plans at all. 2 birthdays of her own passed quietly with no cake, no card, not even a mention. Just her mother making stir-fried noodles like any other Thursday, apologizing softly later. It's just been hectic lately, honey. As if a child's birthday could slip the mind of a parent like an unpaid bill. On social media, her father posted glowing tributes to her younger brother, his basketball games, his perfect attendance awards, even a photo of him holding a fish he'd caught at summer camp. But never once did he post about Anna. Not when she won her school's STEM fair 3 years in a row. Not when she got selected for the statewide science initiative. Not even when she presented her autonomous rover project at the university lab as the youngest participant there. That day he'd said, "It's good. But are you planning to make a living off this kind of thing?" And it wasn't the question itself that hurt. It was the tone. That thin veil of skepticism wrapped in forced encouragement. That familiar undercurrent of, "Don't dream too big, sweetheart." Her mother, sweet and soft-voiced, loved Anna in the quiet way that some mothers do in her cooking, in her folded laundry, in the way she covered her daughter with a blanket when she fell asleep over her textbook. But love in silence still feels like absence when there's no one willing to speak for you. When Anna once overheard her father criticizing her for living in fantasy land, her mother didn't defend her. Later in the kitchen, she only said, "Kona me hu. Nyung mi komun ge kang tang vay ba." I don't want to make things tense with your father. And that was that. Anna learned to swallow things whole, her hurt, her ideas, her accomplishments, and carry them quietly like stones in her pocket. In family photos, she was often half visible, shoved to the corner, her face blocked by someone's shoulder or hidden behind a balloon. If she ever noticed, no one else did. And in the rare picture where her whole face was present, it always wore that same small, closed-lip smile. The one that said, "I'm fine. I'm used to this." The words, "Don't dream too big," echoed through her upbringing like a lullaby turned warning. It came in different forms. "That's not practical. It's good to have a backup. You know, not everything has to be about space and machines. Why can't you be more like your brother?" Each time it chiseled away at her sense of being seen. But still, she dreamed. Not because anyone told her she could, but because it was the only thing that made her feel real. She read Carl Sagan under the covers with a flashlight, not because it was assigned, but because it made her feel less alone. She built code for fun when other kids were watching Netflix, and yet her name was never called first. Never printed in the Christmas newsletter. Never bragged about during holiday dinners. At school, teachers noticed her. She had mentors. She won medals. But at home, it was as if she didn't exist. She once left her science trophy in the living room just to see if anyone would ask about it. No one did. Days later, it was moved to a cabinet under the stairs where no one would trip over it. Her brother, by contrast, once won a school raffle and got a full congratulatory post with 37 likes and 5 comments from extended relatives. Anna got silence. Over time, she stopped showing them her awards. She built her world inward, created blueprints of imagined futures, where no one had to grant her permission to shine. She stopped expecting applause. She learned that invisibility, while painful, could also be protective like a cloak that kept her safe from the exhaustion of trying to prove herself to people who had already decided what she was worth. They thought they knew her, a quiet, polite, strange little girl with her head in the clouds. What they didn't know, what they never stopped to ask, was that inside her mind was a galaxy meticulously charted orbit by orbit, design by design, waiting for the day she would launch. No one helped her apply. No one proofread her essay. No one drove her to the SATs or stayed up late with flashcards. Anna did it all herself, every step, every sentence, every silent night at the kitchen table when the rest of the house was asleep, and the only sound was the scratch of her pen against college-ruled paper. She researched scholarships between shifts at the bookstore, scanned student forms during her 15-minute breaks, and taught herself enough calculus and physics to crush the SAT math section on her own. She used her library discount to buy used prep books with worn corners and coffee stains on the cover. When her acceptance letter arrived, full scholarship to an elite aerospace engineering program, it came not with balloons or flowers or even a simple congrats, but with a passing. "That's good" from her father and a distracted nod from her mother. She didn't cry. She expected nothing, and that made the emptiness less surprising. Night after night she studied until 2 a.m., her eyes dry, her fingers ink-stained, her bones aching from the folding chairs at the bookstore, and the mental math of how many more hours she needed to afford new boots before winter. No one asked how her classes were going. No one noticed the fatigue in her face. Her father still bragged about her brother's varsity team, and still didn't know her major. And her mother, though she smiled gently and folded Anna's clothes just so, still avoided eye contact when the subject of the future came up, afraid maybe of encouraging dreams that might cause tension. So Anna built a world within herself, one of propulsion and equations of metal wings and autonomous systems. She joined a research team focused on simulated flight navigation. She was the only girl selected in the top 5 out of 200 applicants. She remembered walking into the lab for the first time shoulders back, despite the glances that lingered too long or too skeptically. One boy looked up from his code and said, "Oh, are you here to give a talk or something?" She just smiled and sat down, opening her laptop like a scalpel. She didn't need to explain herself. The work would do that. Her project involved designing a self-learning algorithm to adjust mid-air flight paths without human input. She broke her prototype within a week. The second failed on startup. The third froze mid-loop and nearly corrupted the data server. But the fourth flew. She documented everything. She organized her code into neat annotated files. She submitted logs with commentary no one asked for and found bugs no one else had noticed. The professor overseeing the project stopped her after a presentation one day and said, "You know you've got the instincts of a pilot, even when you're just simulating." Anna smiled. She didn't tell him that she'd been flying in her mind since the 3rd grade. Then came the day she packed her bags to leave home. No one offered to drive her to the airport. No one printed directions or helped her weigh her luggage. Her father had gone golfing. Her brother had practice. Her mother had work. So she stood in the doorway of her childhood home, holding 2 suitcases and a folder labeled in clean black marker. When they asked, it held copies of her SAT scores, her essay, her research papers, her lab certification, and the email that confirmed her full scholarship. Everything she'd earned, everything she'd done, everything no one had ever asked about. She stood there for a moment, hoping just a second for a voice to say, "Anna, wait. Tell me about what you're building." But it never came. So she turned, walked to the bus stop, and left. On the ride to the airport, she stared out the window, watching her town disappear piece by piece. The coffee shop with the sticky tables. The bus stop where she once cried in the rain after a math competition. The bookstore where she learned to speak to strangers by recommending paperbacks. And then it was gone, replaced by gray freeway and exit signs. She reached into her bag, pulled out a protein bar, and chewed it slowly, methodically. This was the beginning of something new. Not a rebellion, not revenge, but a reclamation. Her life was no longer waiting for recognition. It was already happening. She kept the folder close, tucked under her arm, even as she passed through security and sat at her gate. She imagined what she'd say if someone ever asked, how she'd explain why she worked so hard when no one was watching. But no one asked. Not then, not for months. Not even after her first successful research upload went viral on the Student Engineering Forum. Not after her professor submitted her algorithm to a national database. Still nothing. Silence from home, as if her departure had been a blip, not a milestone. But Anna didn't mind. Not anymore. She had her questions to ask now, and none of them required permission. She had become her gatekeeper. She decided when the door opened, and she would never again wait for someone else to knock. The training facility looked more like a cross between a spaceport and a war zone. Pentagon protocols woven into NASA precision. It wasn't just elite, it was curated, engineered to test limits and fracture the faint-hearted. Anna stepped onto that campus with her badge clipped straight and her chin high, the only woman in her simulation unit and one of the youngest, but not the most naive. She noticed it almost immediately, the looks, the whispering questions disguised as jokes, the way her name was mispronounced just enough to make it sound like an afterthought. On her second day, A man with aviator sunglasses and an ego louder than the launch pad turned to her during warm-up and asked, "Did you take a wrong turn on your way to yoga class?" She smiled, too controlled to be sweet. "No," she said. "I'm here to fly." But the sting sat heavy in her chest. She trained anyway. She trained harder because of it. The simulators weren't kind. The first time she blacked out mid-run oxygen miscalculation. The second, she entered the wrong sequence during the re-entry drill and failed to stabilize. The third, her timing was perfect, but her heat calculations were off by 2 degrees critical. The fourth, she choked. The fifth, she didn't. But she still failed. Each debriefing was a quiet storm, professors calling her almost colleagues, muttering close. But Anna knew close didn't mean anything, unless you crossed the line. So she went back, again and again. Every night after official training hours, she stayed behind. She reran the simulations on loop until her palms blistered and her throat burned from repeating commands to herself. One night, the cleaning crew found her curled up beside the virtual control module, a sleep headset still on. They called her obsessive. She called it necessary. On her 6th attempt, bleary-eyed sore, her voice barely audible, she not only passed, she broke the record. The module's final screen lit up with a time no one had ever logged. The tech overseeing the session blinked. Wait, she beat it. The room was silent. Anna stood still, her hands shaking not from fear, but from release. Then she turned, picked up her water bottle, and walked out. That night, she didn't celebrate. She went to the track behind the cafeteria, wrapped herself in a sweatshirt 2 sizes too big, and ran until her lungs felt raw. In her ears, her voice whispered through the headset, timed with each footfall. One more time. I don't break. I bend. I rise. She had recorded it for herself like a mantra left behind in the machine. Somewhere along the path, she stopped feeling like she needed to prove anything to the boys in the lab or the officers who didn't believe she belonged. She was chasing something else now, her edge. She installed a camera in her dorm angled toward her practice table and began filming every presentation she prepped for the aerospace committee. One clip in particular, her breakdown of autonomous satellite rerouting algorithms, she edited late one night, fingers trembling from cold and fatigue. She uploaded it to a secure portal, emailed it directly to the Civil Military Research Board, then closed her laptop and stared at the ceiling, wondering if it would matter. A week later, a professor knocked on her lab door with a printout in his hand. "Anna," he said, handing her the paper, "you have a mind like a satellite always calculating the orbit before anyone else sees the gravity." She didn't know what to say, so she nodded quietly, tucked the compliment into the same vault where she stored every bruise, every late night, every doubt she'd turned into fuel. She never told her family. They didn't know about the simulations. They didn't know about the record. They didn't know about the invitation she received to speak at a closed-session forum on the future of unmanned aerial combat response. When her father texted that week asking if she could help him edit a cover letter for her brother's internship, she responded politely like always and never mentioned what she was working on. At some point, she'd stopped waiting for them to ask. At some point, she realized silence from them wasn't a failure of communication, it was their limitation, not hers. Still, sometimes late at night, she'd open the When They Ask folder on her desktop and quietly update it. Not for them anymore. For herself. A record of the climb. A testament to the hours no one witnessed. Her shoulders carried more than equipment and expectations. They bore the invisible weight of every time she'd been told she couldn't, shouldn't, wouldn't. And yet here she was, walking the halls where future missions were designed, simulations, prepared flight paths, debated. She was no longer just building things. She was building belief in herself in a future that didn't require a man to open a door or a family to give permission. Her bruises weren't visible, but they were there in the stiff way she stretched in the morning, in the way she triple-checked every data set, in the silence that had taught her how to focus like a scalpel. She didn't scream her victories. She logged them, She wore them in her posture, in the precision of her speech, in the quiet steadiness that made people pause without knowing why. Every time someone asked her what drove her, she smiled and said, "I like the math." But the truth ran deeper. What drove her wasn't numbers. It was the wound of being underestimated, the ache of invisibility, the quiet fury of a girl who had once been told that cashiering might be her ceiling. And now here she was, not just reaching, but rewriting the altitude. The sink was full of lukewarm water and soap bubbles that clung to the rim like fading frost, and Anna stood with her sleeves rolled up, hands submerged methodically scrubbing a dish that had already been cleaned twice. Outside dusk folded across the yard like a closing curtain. The back door was open just enough to let in the sound of cicadas and the faint rustle of dry leaves. Her father's voice cut through the stillness like a slammed door, sharp, impatient, entitled, "Anna, when you're done with those dishes, get the yard cleaned up and come help me with these insurance forms. You know I don't like this legal crap." She didn't look up. "Yes, sir," she said, quiet and flat, as if her voice was just another part of the appliance hum around her. He didn't say thank you. He never did. The front lawn had already been raked 3 times that week, but it didn't matter. It wasn't about the leaves. It was about the fact that she was home again, back in this house, where her effort had always been invisible, where orders were given without pause and value was measured in usefulness. She rinsed the last plate, turned off the faucet, and reached for the towel. That's when her phone buzzed on the counter, a low hum against the granite that almost blended into the background until the screen lit up with a number she didn't recognize. She stared at it for a beat, her pulse flickering, not fear, not excitement, but something ancient and electric, like the first shiver of a launch sequence. She answered, "Hello." The voice on the other end was crisp, practiced, and authoritative. "This is Colonel Harris with the United States Department of Defense. Is this Commander Anna Nguyen?" She froze. Not because she hadn't been expecting the call, but because she'd been waiting so long to be addressed with the name she had given everything to earn. "Yes, sir. This is she." The colonel didn't pause. "Your security clearance has been fully approved. You are now officially authorized to lead Phase 2 of the Autonomous Defense Flight Program. Welcome aboard, Commander." For a second she couldn't speak. Her mind processed the words like a spacecraft processing signal feedback. Repeat, verify, lock. Approved, authorized, Commander. The call continued details about the onboarding protocol, dates for her full immersion into the command hub near DC, and official relocation plans. She listened, responded where needed, and kept her voice professional, steady, and neutral. But her eyes drifted upward past the chipped ceiling, past the bare light bulb, through the window above the sink where the sky had gone indigo and the stars had just begun to breathe into view. She thought of all the nights she'd stared at that sky as a girl, wondering if it would ever answer her. And now it had. The colonel signed off with a final salute she could hear in his tone. The call ended. The phone went dark in her palm. Silence settled again in the kitchen, except now the silence felt full, electric, waiting, watching. She set the phone down gently beside the sponge and turned off the porch light. Her hands were still damp. Her chest rose and fell slowly, like a rocket cooling after re-entry. She didn't call anyone. She didn't text a friend or open the folder labeled, "When They Ask." No one had asked. No one knew. Not her father in the other room flipping through documents he didn't understand. Not her mother upstairs folding towels in practiced silence. Not her brother probably gaming with his door shut and the volume up too loud. She could walk into the living room and say, "It's say the Pentagon just called me. Commander." But what would be the point? They would blink, nod, maybe even say, "That's nice," in the same way people comment on the weather. They would make it small like they always did. So instead, Anna stepped outside into the backyard, where the wind had picked up just enough to rustle the branches above. She tilted her head back and stared at the stars, distant, steady, ancient, and smiled. It wasn't a proud smile. It wasn't triumphant. It was something softer, deeper, the kind of smile that belongs to people who know what it costs to rise. She whispered, not to anyone, but to the sky itself. "You answered. I don't need him to." The breeze lifted her hair slightly. A leaf tumbled past her feet. She could still hear her father inside his voice, rising in frustration over some document he didn't understand, waiting for her to come fix it like she always had. But this time, she didn't move. This time, she let the sky have her attention instead. She thought of every late night in the lab, every simulation that broke her down and built her back up. She thought of her bruised hands gripping the simulator handles of her voice, whispering in her ears, "I don't break. I bend. I rise." She had done this alone. Not because she wanted to prove something, not because she wanted revenge, but because something inside her refused to accept a version of the world where she was only what they imagined. She had imagined herself higher, and now she was there. Her body stood still, but her mind was already in the sky, already charting the flight paths she would command, already thinking in altitude. She was no longer Anna the daughter, or Anna the girl at the end of the table, or Anna the weird one. She was Commander Anna Nguyen, and the universe finally had called her by name. The hall inside the Pentagon's East Wing gleamed with polished marble, and silence, the kind of silence that came before history, was made before names were etched into places they once weren't allowed. The Autonomous Flight Program unveiling was one of the most anticipated defense briefings of the year, and the room was full, uniforms, crisp name tags, sharp rows of high-ranking officials seated with practiced posture, a blur of medals and quiet authority. The air carried a charge like the hush before liftoff, and somewhere backstage, Anna stood in full blue uniform, hands, steady eyes forward, the silver insignia on her chest, catching light like a star refusing to dim. She had spent weeks preparing for this moment, not just the speech, not just the protocol, but the quiet internal calibration of what it would mean to stand in front of a room like this and speak as someone they once never expected to be here. She had invited her family knowing the risk. Her mother replied with a soft, "We'll see," and her brother never answered. Her father said only, "Where's the parking entrance?" Now standing behind the curtain with the Pentagon seal looming behind the stage, she heard the voice of the Master of Ceremonies step forward. "Ladies and gentlemen, distinguished officers and honored guests. Today we gather not just to unveil a defense milestone, but to recognize the leadership behind it. The U.S. Department of Defense proudly announces Commander Anna Nguyen." There was a beat of silence, half a second or more, and then someone rose. Every person in that auditorium stood the sound of their movement, folding over itself like a wave of chairs, sliding backwards, clicking into place. A spotlight swept over the stage and landed on her as she stepped into it, her head held high, uniform pressed to perfection, her rank gleaming just beneath her name. In that moment, the room did not see a quiet girl in the corner or a forgotten name on a holiday card. They saw Commander Nguyen, architect of the Unmanned Aerial Response System, now under official deployment review. As the applause rose, the cameras panned, searching for faces for reaction. One stopped on a man near the back row, gray at the temples, wearing a button-down shirt that hadn't fit properly in years, tucked into slacks, creased only by the weight of the drive there. He looked out of place, unsure of when to clap, unsure why this was happening the way it was. His eyes were wide, fixed on the stage, his mouth slightly open. The name had hit him like wind to a flame. Commander. Anna. His daughter. He hadn't known she would be the one standing there. He hadn't imagined the applause would be for her. A camera caught the exact moment it landed, when the title collided with memory, when the uniform made her undeniable. And Anna saw it. She saw the shock, the disbelief, and not because she was looking for it, but because she had prepared herself for it. She didn't smile, she didn't wave. She simply stepped to the podium and bowed her head, not out of humility, not out of fear, but as an offering, a gesture of quiet justice. She began her speech without theatrics, her voice measured and low but steady, with the weight of someone who had never asked for attention but had earned every syllable. She spoke about systems, about automation, about redefining flight response under duress. But threaded through the data was something more, something about resilience, about what it means to fly without needing wings handed to you. She spoke of the importance of trust between human and machine of algorithms that adapt under pressure, and of vision, how you must often calculate a trajectory long before the destination becomes visible. And as she spoke, the room didn't move. Not a cough, not a chair shift. Even the highest-ranking officers sat frozen, absorbing not just her words, but the presence of her, what she represented. In another life, in another house, this same girl had once been told she might be lucky enough to marry well, or else end up behind a cash register. That man was now seated in the back row, his hands motionless on his lap. When she finished, she did not wait for applause. She thanked the board, nodded to her colleagues, and stepped down. The ovation rose anyway, deafening, unified, sincere. The light followed her as she exited the stage, her face calm, her hands relaxed at her sides. She didn't look back. She didn't need to. Her father sat there long after the room moved on, watching the spot where she had stood as if hoping she might return and explain something. But there was nothing left to explain. No speech could soften the truth of that moment. She hadn't done this to prove him wrong. She had done it to prove herself right. And that difference, quiet, subtle, but seismic, was what made it justice, not revenge. After the ceremony, after the applause had quieted, and the uniforms blended back into their conversations, after the last handshake and the last commander was spoken with a respectful nod, Anna stepped outside into the hallway, where the air felt less historic and more human. Her father was waiting there, hands in his pockets, eyes roaming the walls like he wasn't sure if he should be impressed or confused. He looked smaller than she remembered, though maybe it was just the way the fluorescent lights made everything more honest. He cleared his throat. That was something he said, searching for a starting point. Didn't expect that, Anna. Didn't realize you were doing all this. But still. His voice softened, almost sheepish. Did it have to be such a big thing? He said it like a joke, like a question, like maybe if he said it lightly enough, it wouldn't land too hard. But it did. It landed exactly the way he meant it to. Anna looked at him, really looked. The man who had once told her not to dream too big. The man who hadn't asked what she was working on, what she was studying, what she was staying up late for. The man who had cheered louder for her brother's middle school basketball than he ever had for her science fair trophies. Her voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. You don't need to be surprised, she said evenly, because you never asked what I was trying to do. There was no anger in it, no performance, just a fact. It sat between them like a closed door neither of them had built overnight. Her father didn't argue. He nodded once, maybe out of acknowledgement, maybe because there was nothing else to say. He didn't apologize. She didn't expect him to. And they didn't hug. There was no music swelling in the background, no dramatic reconciliation. Just two people who had finally seen each other clearly and still couldn't quite meet in the middle. That night, Anna returned to her temporary quarters. She took off the uniform piece by piece, folded it gently, and placed it on the chair. She lay on the bed in silence, not crying, not smiling, just still. The kind of stillness that comes after movement, not defeat. She stared at the ceiling, not thinking of the speech, not thinking of the standing ovation, or the camera catching her father's face mid-recognition. She thought of all the quiet hours that had led her here, the nights she stayed awake in silence, the moments she doubted herself but kept building anyway, the years she waited for someone to notice but didn't wait to move forward. The applause had been loud, but it wasn't what stayed with her. What stayed was the fact that she no longer needed it. Not from a room, not from her father, not even from herself. After a while she sat up, opened her suitcase and pulled out a small box she had packed last minute. Inside it were old photos, family portraits taken before her name had weight, before she was anything more than the quiet girl at the end of the table. She sifted through them slowly. One in particular caught her eye, the holiday photo from when she was maybe 11. Everyone was smiling, crowded around the fireplace. Her brother held a new basketball. Her mother leaned in just enough to look warm. And Anna? Anna stood off to the side, barely in frame, half her face blurred by someone else's shoulder. She stared at it for a moment, then picked up a small pair of scissors from the drawer. With steady hands, she cut along the edge of her face, separating it from the rest. Not out of spite, not out of hurt, but as an act of reclamation. She placed the small cutout into a frame of its own, simple black, no embellishment, and set it beside the bed. It was the first time she had seen herself, and only herself, in a frame. And in that image there was something unspoken. Not a girl who had been left out, but a woman who had stepped out. There was no caption, no date. Just a face that no longer needed to be part of someone else's picture to matter. She lay back down, hands folded over her chest, breath slow and even. No texts came, no calls. The world outside the window was dark and still, and that was okay. She didn't need the world to say anything tonight. She had said enough for herself. She had stood on a stage without trembling. She had looked into a crowd that once doubted her and stood taller for it. And now she had sat across from the man who once boxed in her future and walked away without needing his permission to feel whole. There was no revenge in it, no anger, just distance. Quiet, necessary distance. The kind that doesn't punish, only protects. She wasn't bitter. She wasn't broken. She had simply outgrown the version of herself that waited to be seen. She had learned to stand up without noise, to shine without a spotlight. And that, more than any medal or rank, was the moment she knew she had arrived. The command center was quiet in the way only rooms full of decisions could be monitors, humming softly, lights low, and focus the steady beep of data transmissions bouncing off satellite signals thousands of miles above the Earth. Anna stood at the end of a long conference table, a matte black folder in front of her, the final authorization papers inside. Her name was printed on the top in bold type, Commander Anna Nguyen, lead engineer. Autonomous Satellite Launch Division. Her hand didn't shake as she picked up the pen. Around her, the team waited. Not in awe, not in doubt, but in respect. They knew she'd built this from scratch, that the satellite scheduled for deployment at 0300 had been imagined, programmed, and refined under her direction. She reviewed the coordinates one last time, double-checked the encryption codes, then signed her name. There was no ceremony, no spotlight, just a quiet nod from the systems chief and the hum of something irreversible being set in motion. As she stepped back from the table, one of her colleagues, a younger recruit who'd joined the program only 6 weeks earlier, glanced over with curiosity and asked, half-joking, half-serious, "So, why this? Why aerospace? Why fight this hard for something so impossible?" Anna looked at him for a moment, not with pride, but with something steadier. "Because I wanted to fly high enough," she said, "that no one could point at me and tell me who to be." Her words weren't loud, but they landed like truth always does in the quiet part of people's minds where questions have lived too long unanswered. The recruit nodded, unsure what to say, but understanding more than he expected. Anna didn't elaborate. She didn't need to. Some things don't require explanation. Later that night, she returned to her quarters, changed out of her uniform into a simple gray hoodie, and opened her laptop. There was a message from her mother, just a missed video call, and a follow-up text. "Call me if you're free. Just wanted to say hi." She hesitated, then clicked call. The screen lit up with her mother's face, soft and familiar, framed by the floral curtains of their living room. "Hey, Con," her mother said gently. "I watched the broadcast. Your father did too." Anna's face didn't change. She waited. He didn't say much. Her mother continued. Just sat there afterward, quiet. All day. Didn't even turn the TV back on. Anna didn't respond. She only nodded once. There was nothing else to say. Her mother seemed to understand. He may not say it, but he sees now. Anna looked at the screen. Not angry, not hopeful, just still. "It's okay, Mom. He doesn't have to say anything." There was a pause. Her mother blinked, a mix of sadness and pride. "I'm proud of you," she said quietly. Anna offered a small smile. "I know." After the call ended, Anna stood by the window looking out into the night. The sky was clear, the stars sharp and scattered like code across the darkness. Somewhere up there, just beyond reach, but no longer beyond her, was the satellite her team had just authorized waiting for liftoff. She thought of everything it had taken to get here, the long hours, the dismissals, the silence from home, the voices that had once tried to define her before she ever had a chance to define herself. She thought of the girl who had sat at family dinners, with a smile so practiced it felt like a muscle, who had studied astrophysics at a library table while others partied, who had packed her bags and left without anyone asking where she was going. That girl had never needed applause. She only needed clarity. And now she had it. Wind brushed against the window pane, soft and persistent. She could hear the hum of the launch team below, checking systems, verifying lock sequences. The countdown had begun. She rested her hand on the glass and whispered, not for anyone else to hear, but because it felt like something she had to say aloud. "I don't need anyone to say I did it. I just need to know I did." The words felt like breath more than sound, like truth folding gently into air. She stepped back from the window, the silence not empty but earned. She didn't feel victorious. She felt grounded. Not because she had finally become something, but because she had always been something, only now she didn't need permission to believe it. Commander wasn't the title that made her real. It wasn't the badge or the stage or even the launch that validated her path. It was the choice again and again to keep walking forward without waiting to be invited. It was the belief that she belonged, even when no one else believed it yet. And now, as her signature orbited in the form of flight code and guidance commands, as her name moved with the trajectory of something vast and engineered to last, she understood one final truth. The highest place she could reach was not the sky, not even space. It was the moment she no longer asked anyone to notice she was rising.